The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild was a very successful game. Pretty much everybody loved it and talked about it, and it sold so well that it basically forced the Switch to succeed. A lot of people consider it to be the best Zelda game ever made, and some people even put it among the best games ever made. Period. Space, indent. And for a game that got such high praise, it would seem like a sequel to it, especially one on the same system that runs on a lot of the same assets from the first game, should be a very similar type of experience. But should it? What sorts of things should the sequel to Breath of the Wild keep from the first game, and what sorts of things would be better to change? What can Nintendo afford to change with a game like this, given the restraints of time and money, and how should they strike the right balance between keeping what people loved in the first game and giving people a new experience? Hello all 2,310 of you, I'm Redkwan, and what should Zelda Breath of the Wild 2 change? Well, let's first start with openness. The fact that you could do almost anything in any order in Breath of the Wild was the reason so many people loved it. Once you got off the Great Plateau, you could essentially do whatever you wanted. You could go off and face Ganon at that point. It allowed for way more exploration, more unique experiences for different players, and a more alive world. But it also had some drawbacks. The story was there, but it was in pieces, and it was something you might miss, or at least not fully experience, if you weren't dedicated to finding it. Plus, the story was disconnected from the present events, so it felt more like a side story than an actual story for the game. Also, because you didn't need to do dungeons, the dungeons weren't that great, and they weren't able to include any interesting items. The only real items were the runes, which you had the whole game, and of which there were only 4. Overall, people seem to really enjoy Breath of the Wild's openness, and for the first game, that was the right decision, but should the sequel be as open as the first? And I think ideally, the answer is no. If Nintendo could find a way to solve the problem that the openness of the first game caused, while keeping the benefits, that would be terrific, and Nintendo would be able to make something that both types of Zelda fans would love. But the question is, how do they accomplish that? And if they need to sacrifice something, what should they let go? Let's start with the story. Can Nintendo make a story that actually ties in with the events of the game, and that you get in order, and without having to search it all out yourself? And can they also do that while having a game that's as open as people will be expecting for a Breath of the Wild sequel? It's definitely a challenge. If they want to have it as open as Breath of the Wild, then no, they can't do it. Maybe they can do something better than memories, but if you really want players to be able to go straight to the end from the beginning, then no, you can't really have a meaningful real-time story. But if Nintendo made the game a little less open, and did something where you had to go to every dungeon before you faced the final boss, but could do them in any order, and could explore at your own pace, then there could be a fairly good real-time story, I think. Obviously, it wouldn't be as ideal as having a linear progression, but the dungeons could each have their own little story that ties into the greater story, and I think they could make it work. The question is it worth sacrificing the complete freedom of Breath of the Wild? Well, let's look at some of the other factors and see if this change benefits anything else. How do you make better dungeons while still keeping the game open? Obviously, the Divine Beasts weren't perfect, although part of that was just that their designs weren't that interesting besides the movement. That can be helped fairly easily though, and I think to some extent they could have been better in Breath of the Wild too. The problem that's harder to fix is with the items. Zelda dungeons are largely so fun because of the progression up to receiving an item, and then the progression with the item. The problem with Breath of the Wild was that they didn't want to have an item that only did anything in a dungeon, and they didn't want to force you to do a dungeon to see the world. So they made dungeons without special items. Obviously this is a bit more of a challenge, but I do think there are still some ways around it without sacrificing too much from the openness. Either the items could be pretty useless but still usable out in the world, and while most of the world is available without them, you can find little secrets every so often with them. Or the item you get mid-dungeon could be weakened by some version of the one you get from completing the whole dungeon. Revali's Gale being a push that only gets you up half as high or something similar, for example. I don't know, that's kinda dumb. Neither of these is ideal, but they would fix the dungeon problem to some extent, without sacrificing the openness. But if Nintendo went the way of needing to do every dungeon before the final boss, but in any order, Nintendo could make the next Zelda game have real items again, that actually had some use. Obviously they'd still be limited in the world, but you could have little secrets you find with your items, and there could still be a final dungeon that uses all of them before the final fight. Obviously that's a sacrifice Nintendo might not be willing to make after the praise the original got for its pure freedom, but it does solve some of the problems from the first game, and I don't think the sacrifice is undoable. Is it the right decision though? I'm not sure. It's the decision I would prefer because I really enjoy the stories and dungeons from the old Zelda games, but it might have some backlash from the people who loved Breath of the Wild for what it was. I would probably say it's worth it, especially if the world is the same, which it appears to mostly be, but it's also a risk. And if Nintendo wants to play it safe, I think people would still be all over a sequel that goes the same route. Speaking of the world, what sorts of changes should we see there? From the trailer and some of the quotes, it seems like the world is going to be pretty much the same as from the last Breath of the Wild, and I have some mixed feelings about that. Obviously, the world is massive and they took a lot of time to make it, so making a brand new world would have probably been a bigger commitment than they were willing to make, but a lot of the reason people loved Breath of the Wild was because of the joy of exploring the world, and I don't know if that's going to be as much fun the second time around. I'm sure there will be new landmarks and big changes to the location and characters we've seen, but it's still a little worrying. I'd be surprised if there weren't big new areas around, but if it's too similar, that could be a problem. I think Nintendo should make it as different as they reasonably can within what makes sense. If they're going to make something anywhere near as open as the first, they need the world to be interesting to explore again, and I think they're going to have to put in a lot of work to make that happen. The interesting thing is that based on the trailer, you would imagine the sequel would be much more linear, much more story-focused, in a fairly new area, and a lot darker. Maybe Nintendo actually is planning to go all in on some of these things. In my mind, it's probably just to show off new ideas in an interesting trailer, but maybe not. At the very least, the darker theme seems to be a part of this game, but how far should they go in on this? And I think the answer here is all the way. Oh, he's breaking down the sideline, and they're not gonna catch him! He's gonna go all the way! Touchdown! I should stop doing things like this. I think they're scaring people away. But I do think Nintendo should go all in on the dark tone. The game needs to feel different than Breath of the Wild, and if it has the same world, the same gameplay, and the same open-endedness, which it seems to a large extent, it has to feel different in some major way. And I think this is a good way to do it. Also, Zelda fans eat this stuff up. So what should Breath of the Wild 2 change? Well, I think it's going to be hard to go too different from the original, and I think it really needs to have a different feel. I think the solution is to go all in on the dark themes, obviously not to the point where it's destroying children's hopes and dreams, but at least to the point where it's definitely a different feel, to change up the world and add big new locations as much as they possibly can within the same area, which it seems like they're going to use again, and to revive dungeons and items as much as possible without totally sacrificing the open world, which is a delicate balance. But I do think this is all possible. In any case, I think Zelda Breath of the Wild 2 is going to be a very exciting game, and hopefully we get to play it soon, because apparently nothing else is coming this year. Well, I'm Redkwan. Are you excited for Breath of the Wild 2? What do you think it should change from the original? What would you name the sequel to Breath of the Wild 2? My choice would be The Legend of Zelda Wild Green. Because of the green stuff. You know what I'm saying. Pretty good, right? Anyways, I'm Redkwan. Thank you all for watching, and I'll hopefully see you all later. Goodbye.